Hello and welcome to this little island amid the ocean that YouTube is. A bit differently from my previous videos, which were more focused on the cultural and historical characteristics of an indigenous group, today we will be looking at a broader situation, meaning we will talk about Taiwan's indigenous people, which are composed of different recognized and unrecognized groups. Truth be told, my original idea was to research each unrecognized indigenous people and provide information on each group's cultural history. Yet, as I was researching for this video, I found that, besides my own time constraints, information about each individual indigenous group is hard to come by, elevating how little is still written, or at least widely available, on these groups, in which some are often brushed under one big group of indigenous people, the Pingpu. So without further ado, let's turn our full attention to the beautiful island of Taiwan. Situated in the western Pacific Ocean, Taiwan consists of a main island and many smaller surrounding islands, which, before the arrival of the Dutch, had as its own inhabitants the Taiwanese indigenous people, also known as the Formosan people, Austronesian Taiwanese people, or Kaotian people. The Taiwanese indigenous people are made up of different tribes, traditionally with over 26, 16 of which are recognized today by the Taiwanese government. Each tribe had its own governing system, so there was no central government in their society, and their lifestyle was based on hunting and gathering as well as fishing. Taiwan was a self-governing island until the 1600s, being colonized by the Dutch from 1624 until 1661 and occupied in the northern side by the Spanish from 1626 until 1642. Taiwan saw its population grow as the Dutch employed Han Chinese to work the fields of their sugar, cane, and rice plantations. They also brought in 25,000 Han Chinese to be their soldiers, leaving the total number of new Han Chinese in Taiwan anywhere between 30,000 to 100,000. In comparison, the population of indigenous people at that time was around 69,000. Then, in 1661, Zheng Chengan fled mainland China alongside his supporters. Upon their arrival, they sieged the Dutch stronghold at Anping, which culminated in the Dutch loss of power over Taiwan. After his death, his son Zhengjing would use their base in Taiwan to continue the fight against the Qin. With his death in 1681, a Qing invasion fleet would soon arrive and take over in 1683. Putting an end to the Ming restorationist movements. As the Qing dynasty took over Zhang Zhenggon's kingdom of Tungning, it began establishing permanent communities and settlements around plantations and farming lands. Whilst the Dutch forces had focused on trade and, perhaps consequently, on the central locations of the island, the Qing focused on expanding and gaining economic power and administrative control over the indigenous communities, especially those in remote parts of the islands. To accomplish this, the Qing authorities encroached even more upon indigenous lands, illegally allowing new settlers to live in those territories. Other Sinization efforts by the Chinese can be seen through their establishment of schools modeled after the Chinese education system of that time. These government-run and sponsored academies were strategically placed throughout different indigenous territories to wash out indigenous cultures and assimilate indigenous peoples into a new Chinese way of life. With the increasement of the Han population, so did power over indigenous groups grew, and with it, more land was passed to Han Chinese through imperial edicts. By some estimates, 50% of the land in Taiwan was still controlled by indigenous people at the time of Taiwan's transfer to Japan by treaty in 1895, especially in the mountain center of the island. The Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895 between Japan and China would cede Taiwan and the Pion Islands to Japan, initially using the long and sour dispute between Taiwan and China to garner support. Japan would increasingly isolate the indigenous groups from other settlers, withheld resources such as weaponry, and punished those who did not follow Japanese regulations and/or customs. From 1930, authorities started to embark on policies aimed at turning communities into Japanese. The forcible movement of whole communities moved to low-lying areas near Japanese military and police outposts. The hunting down and killing of rebels and the enforcement of Japanese language and names. When China regained control of Taiwan after 1945, its policies were as devastating as the Japanese ones had been. The defeated Kuomintang, or KMT, fled to Taiwan and established the Republic of China. Using the same initial method as Japan had, they used the sour relations to demonize the Japanese rule. They declared all people to be Chinese and disregarded all indigenous identities, suppressing their rights and cultures in new impactful ways. Any attempts to protest against the KMT's identity impositions were responded to and suppressed with brutality, leading to martial law and a period referred to as White Terror. As they controlled education, the curriculum was filled with stereotypes that categorized indigenous as savages and less than human, whilst elevating the Han race and its superiority in comparison. Martial law would last from 1949 until 1987 and removed all political parties, freedom of speech, and human rights of both indigenous people and old settlers. The new government measures imposed not only the exclusive use and domination of the Mandarin language, but further eroded indigenous land rights. Legislation adopted in 1968, ostensibly to protect indigenous lands, in reality had almost contrary effects. Unless land was cultivated for 10 years, it became state property. This meant that indigenous communities had to abandon their traditional hunting, gathering, and slash-and-burn agricultural activities, thus signaling a near-death blow to many aspects of their cultures. With this legislation, the government, Han Chinese individuals, and/or corporations could lease land for commercial and other uses, thus mining any actual control of indigenous people over their land and resulting on the land eventually being, sometimes illegally, owned by Han Chinese. If you've seen my previous video regarding the Ainu indigenous of Japan, you may remember that Japan did something similar to the Ainu. By the end of the Japanese period, the indigenous peoples of Taiwan had been divided into two groups, the Mountains people and the Plains people, or as to China, Highland and Lowland people. For the colonizers, the differentiating factor was the way each group interacted with the immigrants. Whilst the Mountains indigenous people lived in the center and east coast, most of the Plain indigenous people resided on the beach, plains and hills in western Taiwan, making them more prone to contact with foreign powers. During the Qing dynasty ruling over Taiwan, the Han population on the island increased dramatically, leading to the acculturation of the lives of Plain indigenous peoples. By intermarrying with Han, adopting an agricultural lifestyle affected by Han, and learning Mandarin from Han, Plains indigenous people were gradually civilized. On the contrary, Mountain indigenous people maintained their original customs, which were considered uncivilized by dominators. This resistance from the Mountain indigenous people would make them today more easily recognized as indigenous, providing them an authenticity of ethnicity, whilst the Plains people are seen as acculturated. Yet despite the distinctions made by authorities, Plain and Mountain indigenous people share, to a varying degree, common cultural characteristics such as traditions, techniques such as tattooing, rice wine making, embroidering and wood carving motifs, linguistic and genetic ties to other Australasian people. Many thought the two groups owned social and cultural internal consistency respectively and were opposite to each other. However, not only Mountain indigenous people but also Plain indigenous people contain abundant diversity of cultures within more than 10 tribes they each include. The decrease of KMT's domination and Taiwan's move toward a more liberal democracy allowed indigenous people to begin claiming their right to land and culture. In 1984, the first non-governmental organization dedicated to promoting and protecting the rights and interests of indigenous people was founded, the Alliance of Taiwan Aborigines. By 1994, this resulted in the amendment of the Republic of China's constitution, with indigenous peoples being recognized as original inhabitants instead of mountain compatriots. Although the situation has improved, in recent years we find, for example, the Indigenous Language Development Act that was passed in May 2017, there are still several indigenous people residing in the plains collectively known as Pingpu. They are still not formally recognized. Some of the pushback against the Pingpu comes from already recognized groups, due to fear its recognition would further dilute the already scarce resources for cultural preservation and revitalization efforts. Despite the social, cultural, and political rights that mountain indigenous people have already acquired, the government has not yet proposed any plans to amend laws for their collective rights. With approximately 26 distinct tribes, only 16 are currently recognized by the government of Taiwan. 3 are locally recognized, and the remaining 10 still fight for recognition. The 16 recognized indigenous people are, and I apologize for the name butchering, the Ami, Atayal, Bunun, Lalua, Kavalan, Kanakanavu, Paiwan, Puyuma, Rukai, Saisiat, Sakizawa, Sidi, Tao, Su, and Truku, whilst Maketao, Siraya, and Taiwan are locally recognized tribes. The 10 unrecognized tribes are Babuza, Basai, Aunia, Ketagalan, Luilang, Pase or Kashabu, Papura, Kauhau, Tauka, and Trobian. Besides the high unemployment rates of the indigenous people, many feel their culture is exploited through tourism, while land rights continue to be one of the biggest struggles these indigenous people face. Amusement parks that claim to be preserving indigenous cultures, but in reality turn what is sacred and precious to them into entertainment for tourists and increase their economic gain just a little more. Recognized as a sovereign country only by 12 countries and international still bound to China, Taiwan's situation itself is complicated. Fighting to reclaim its independence from long ago and with a population seen as predominantly Han Chinese, Taiwan's indigenous people may face more difficulties in gaining the necessary support and recognition than some of the cases we've looked at in this channel before. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, as it helps the growth of this channel. And please let me know what is your thoughts on this situation.